see if anybody's comes in. All right, good afternoon and welcome to our Teacher in the Workplace webinar. These sessions have been created to assist our teachers and administration through the COVID pandemic. I would like to first thank our teachers and administrators who are joining us live today. Thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in this webinar. And we would like to thank and acknowledge those teachers who may be hearing this message later and download in the weeks and days to come. I would like to thank our committee, who some of you are on here today, the Workforce Investment Board and the Business Education Partnership. Also like to thank Chestnut Ridge for their assistance with this project today. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are running today's session as a webinar rather than a meeting so that Dr. Maneta will have ample time to share her important message with us. We may have some time for questions at the end of the presentation, so please use the chat feature. If you use the Q&A, I can get those as well, but I prefer you use the chat. And we will convey those questions to Dr. Maneta. So just a little bit of background on Dr. Maneta. We've been working with her over the past couple months through this COVID pandemic with our Flash Talks, and we're excited to have her do this presentation for you all today. Dr. Maneta is a board-certified child and adolescent psychiatrist. She leads the delivery and treatment service as the medical director of New Directions, a partial hospitalization program here in Fayette County. Dr. Maneta received her medical degree from the University of New Jersey Medical School and completed her adult psychiatric training at Harvard Longwood Psychiatric Residency Training Program. Wow, it's a mouthful.
It's a tongue twister.
It is. She also completed her child and adolescent psychiatry training at the Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. She's retained faculty academic position at Harvard Medical School since 2013. So we are very fortunate to have her with us today and to share this important information. So everybody, please welcome Dr. Maneta, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you for having me back and giving me this opportunity to talk more about stress. So let me figure out the technical pieces first. Let me share my screen. All right, are you able to see my screen? Oh, and there we go.
Gotta love technology.
Yep.
I think it's me sometimes.
Blank screen for when it loads. Oh, there we go. Okay. There we go. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about today is the notion of learning under stress. And, you know, you could probably guess why I picked that topic, given what's going on these days and these past few months now, almost heading to a year, basically. So let's just jump right into it. And then, you know, I'll try to definitely leave a lot of time at the end because I want to get to your guys' questions, because I think that's going to be the way to make this most helpful, is if you get the chance to ask any questions or make any comments that you might be feeling are important. So when we think about learning under stress, we think, you know, we want to take a step back and kind of think about stress in the classroom, which doesn't necessarily always need to be a bad thing. So there's a lot of natural consequences and natural stressors, rather, that happen in the classroom. So what are some examples of that? I mean, exams, that's the easiest thing to think about when you think about stress in the classroom. So students have to take exams, be evaluated, they have to go through evaluations. That can cause some stress levels, but we will actually talk in a second about how that can be helpful too. Deadlines, if they have to submit projects, if they have to submit papers. Public speaking can be another stressor for kids in the classroom. So having to speak in front of their peer cohort, they have to speak in front of other adults, the teacher, maybe other people who might be watching them. All of those can be natural stressors that happen in the classroom. And then, of course, peers can act either as supports or as stressors. So thinking for kids, thinking how they are going to be perceived by their peers, the notion that their peers may be, applauding them and supporting them, or again, the notion that their peers might be criticizing them, or maybe, to more extreme situations, making fun of them or bullying them. So these are just some natural stresses that happen in the classroom that have been happening all along, are not new to this day and age. And again, even though they are associated with the word stress, which a lot of times has a negative meaning to it, we're actually going to talk in a second about how some of these might be helpful, and why they have been important, and why they have remained as such in today's classrooms. So before we go into that, I wanted to very, very quickly and rather superficially talk about what happens in the body when there's stress. So the first reaction that our bodies go into whenever there's stress is what's called the fight or flight response. A lot of people will probably have heard of this phrase. Essentially, what this response means is that there is an increase in certain chemicals called catecholamines, fancy word. And these chemicals then actually lead to they activate different brain regions. So the 3 brain regions that are most important in terms of learning are the ones that I've highlighted here, and that's the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex being kind of our brain's CEO, as I like to think about it, the area in the brain that kind of drives the executive functioning, our executive functioning as individuals and human beings. So essentially, again, what happens is when you encounter a stressor, whether that be an exam or a deadline, the first thing that happens to your body is this fight or flight response with this increased release in catecholamines and the resultant activation in these brain regions. A little bit later on, a second part of the body also gets activated. So another fancy term, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. I promise there's no test on these concepts at the end of this presentation. So the HPA axis, as we call it for short, also gets activated under stress. And that axis is responsible for the release of a different chemical, a hormone in this case called cortisol, which is responsible for the more delayed effects of stress. And what this hormone is responsible for is some activation, but also kind of resetting the balance, particularly in the hippocampus and the amygdala. And we're actually going to talk a lot more about cortisol a little bit later on, because you'll see how this hormone specifically is more related to the chronic stressors that we're going to be identifying a little bit later on. So moving on in terms of this response and going back to the catecholamines, so why do we actually care for them when it comes to learning? Well, because through their action in certain brain regions, mainly the amygdala and the hippocampus, they actually enhance memory formation. And as you can imagine, memory formation is going to be a very, very, very important step in terms of learning new information and even consolidating and updating information as well. So what you can get from that is that stress, again, is not all that bad. And we'll talk when it becomes bad, but there's clear positive effects to some level of stress when it comes to learning. And that's the evidence basically that also backs up the notion of continuing to have things like exams and deadlines and evaluations in schools. And we also talked about cortisol, and basically the role of cortisol is to improve the efficiency of the processing of the information, and that mainly happens in the amygdala. So both the catecholamines and cortisol definitely play important roles when it comes to consolidating memory, learning new things, and consolidating learning. So, take home points from that moderate stress can actually enhance memory formation. Now, there's some caveats to that statement, though. The stressor has to be related somehow to the material. So what we mean by that is you can have the stress of the exam and you're going to have enhancements in memory formation as long as the material that you're studying is related to that exam for which you are stressed. So there has to be some kind of connection between the stressor and the material, or there has to be some kind of emotional importance to that material. So when we think about emotional importance, we think about pieces of information that have emotional meaning. So I can't tie it really to stress right now. I'm not thinking of a good example, but like a birthday, or if we take it from a negative context, the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, like things that will have emotional, meaning if the material itself is emotional, then again, like some moderate forms of stress can actually improve the learning around that material. But stress can also impair memory formation for unrelated material, and long-term stress can also impair learning in general. And again, we'll talk about that in a second as well. So what about the timing of stress? Is that important? Does that play a role? And the answer to that is yes. So we actually, stress at random times is not going to necessarily improve learning. You actually have to have stress around the time of learning. And that's going to be the stress that's going to potentially lead to enhancements in terms of memory formation and in terms of learning. Whereas if you have stressors that are long before or that exceed the time of the actual learning, then that's when you actually might start hindering the process and have impairments instead of doing better in it. And this is just a picture to say the same thing, probably in better ways than what I explained at the top. The top side of the diagram demonstrates stressors that occur at times that actually enhance memory. Stressors are indicated with the red flashes. And so you can see that a stress right before encoding new information or right after encoding new information and between encoding and consolidation can actually enhance memory formation. Whereas stressors long before encoding in the bottom side of the diagram, so stressors long before encoding, right before retrieval or right before updating can actually impair memory and have negative long-term consequences when it comes to learning. So there's a lot of things that we at any given time will need to be aware of for stressors. So, you know, the amount of stress, the timing of the stress is going to be important, and the material that's related and how the material is related to the stressor is going to be important in terms of knowing when we're actually having quote unquote good stress, if I might say that, versus stress that negatively impacts learning. So what does that make us think about when it comes to chronic stress? So all the research to date has shown that chronic stressors do not act in a positive way. They actually lead to what's called neurotoxicity, which could be a fancy way for talking about damage to nerve cells, to neurons. And what we see is that with chronic stress, we actually have impairment in attention, impairment in memory, and impairment in emotional processing. And these are three very, very, very important processes that play a huge role in learning. So if you have impairments in these three processes, you can obviously imagine that there's going to be impairments in long-term learning. And why? So now, why are we actually talking about all of this? Well, the elephant in the room, which I haven't brought up yet, is COVID-19 and how COVID-19 has actually changed the amount of stress that's experienced in the classroom, why it's changed the amount of stress that's experienced, and what might happen in the long term in terms of learning because of COVID-19. So we, have been in this pandemic since essentially last February or March. We're almost going on a year, so we are definitely within the context of talking about chronic stress at this point, particularly now in the fall as cases have peaked, stress has also significantly increased. And so at this point, I think we can start wondering about whether we're going to be seeing some neurotoxicity, again, fancy term for some nerve damage. And when I say nerve damage, I don't mean necessarily permanent nerve damage, but definitely impairments in the way that nerve cells work and essentially negative effects on learning because of that. So one of the things that we can think about in terms of COVID-19 and stressors and how it affects learning is the fact that we know that COVID-19 has already had a lot of negative impact in terms of children's mental health. So we see a lot of different conditions on the rise ever since the pandemic. So some of these I've put on this slide. So anxiety disorders, kids are presenting with a lot more worry thoughts, a lot more perseverative thinking in terms of the illness itself, what it's causing to their families, the financial stressors that might be tied to it, the changes in their day-to-day life, their isolation, the constriction. So we definitely have been seeing a rise in generalized anxiety, in school phobias, all of which fall under the anxiety disorders. We've also seen a rise in depressive disorders. So a lot more mood lability, a lot more irritability, a lot more sadness, a lot more tearfulness, all kind of linking back to the effects of the pandemic. We've also seen trauma responses. We've seen kids react to this pandemic in a way that is similar to how they would react to other kinds of stressors. So we see hypervigilance, constant, again, like a ruminating thought pattern, worrying over and over and excessively about certain things, and just having this very like a fight or flight response, honestly, just because of the pandemic itself. We have seen a rise in substance abuse. This is true for children and adults, unfortunately. It could be seen as a maladaptive coping skill that a lot of folks are unfortunately turning to in terms of limiting the symptoms that they're experiencing, but definitely something that we need to be aware of because it makes things a lot worse for children, obviously. Then we've also seen a rise in externalizing disorders. So kids who already had maybe ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder kind of struggling a lot more ever since the pandemic because of a multitude of reasons. And last but not least, and very, very serious, we've also seen a rise in suicidality. And again, true for both children and adults, and something that has the the psychiatric organizations, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the American Psychiatric Association, very, very worried because we have seen a huge uptick in suicidal ideation and suicidal behaviors. So one way that we could postulate that we could think about COVID-19 affecting, causing long-term stress and affecting kids in terms of their learning is through their own mental health reasons. And there had been, prior to COVID, there had actually been a lot of research done on how things like childhood depression actually lead to low educational attainment. And I use depression as the example here, but it's true for a lot of different child mental health illnesses. And so if you add COVID-19 to that, which we know now has been causing more distress in kids and has been leading to more mental health issues, then you can actually see how the link now starts to form in terms of COVID-19 then having a long-term impact in terms of learning and education. So what are some other ways that the COVID-19 pandemic may actually be affecting kids in terms of their learning, and other ways that might be, other reasons rather, that might be leading to stress? When a couple of things that come to mind are all the changes that have basically happened in terms of how kids learn. So first and foremost, the notion of homeschooling. So a lot of schools, actually all the schools last March, or April, if I remember correctly, had to go to virtual schooling. So kids, started having to learn at home. So that had its own challenges, its own issues that we're going to talk about in a second. The fact that we had to now rely on digital devices, virtual learning, digital learning, has been a huge stressor for kids and for teachers and for parents, for sure. The fact that all of this has caused a disruption in the normal social skill development process that kids engage through in schools has been a major stressor for kids. And then nowadays, more recently, the fact that we've had to go through this cycle of virtual, hybrid, in-person, and then start all over again, kind of like virtual, hybrid, in-person, depending on cases, depending on kids' own exposures, depending on school-wide exposures, and depending on what's going on in communities. So all of these have been huge stressors for not just kids, but also teachers and families as well. And then last but not least, which we definitely want to kind of focus on a little bit, is the notion of learning loss, and how that too can actually cause stress in kids. Maybe not the type of stress that they might be aware of in the here and now, but definitely a more long-term stress that they're going to have to deal with as they progress through the different grades, and as they have to constantly make up lost time and fill gaps. So thinking about each of these different stressors one-on-one. So when we think about homeschooling, what are some of the considerations that might be stressful for kids? So first of all is the need for a quiet space in order to make homeschooling successful. So a lot of kids don't necessarily have access to a quiet space. A lot of families, and this is a lot, I'm talking about this a lot from personal experience, from working with the kids at New Directions too. A lot of them don't necessarily have the luxury to have one space in the house where they can isolate and actually have peace and quiet to be able to do their schoolwork and participate on all the online activities. A lot of children have to share rooms with siblings, or a lot of families might be also working from home. So that means more people in a rather small constricted space, all needing to engage in some kind of virtual meeting or another. So that has been a big stressor for kids and families. And then having parents who can actually provide appropriate academic supervision has been another big stressor. So what we've seen at New Directions is that when parents were available and able to provide supervision for kids, kids would definitely do better compared to their other peers who might not necessarily have that luxury. And that could be either because the parent is just not able to help the kid, the parent doesn't understand the material themselves, or the parent is not available to the kid, the parent has to work either in the home or out of the home, or even in rare but still very unfortunate situations where the parent doesn't recognize the importance of this and doesn't seem to give it the proper attention and the proper and give the kids the attention that they need. Time constraints has been a big issue. So even for those parents who are willing, again, they have to juggle a lot of things. So being able to give the child the time needed to help them through the schooling process has been a major stressor for kids and families. And again, kind of leading to a lot of arguments sometimes between parents and children. Gaps in childcare. So there's been issues for parents who have to work outside of the home to try to find other adults who can maybe provide some of that academic supervision, or at the very least even provide any kind of childcare. So that has been another major stressor for folks. And then the general, family-related stressors that a lot of folks have experienced in the context of this pandemic. So, financial stress, unemployment being two big ones, fear about the illness, how this has affected the whole family, potentially having gotten sick themselves and how that's affected the whole family. So all of this really leading to a lot of frustration and burnout amongst kids and families. Then moving on to digital learning and the fact and talking about the fact that it's a very unknown territory. While technology has obviously been in our lives for a very, very long time, last March was the first time that we had to solely rely on it all of a sudden to deliver a lot of things. I mean, right now I'm talking to you guys about education primarily, but even in terms of having to deliver, full-on therapy, full-on group therapy, full-on psychopharmacology through only digital methods has been a big challenge for all of us. And then thinking about, more related to kids and what their challenges have been, a lot of kids have not had access to technology. So in order to be successful in the world of digital learning, you obviously have to have certain access to reliable devices and reliable internet. And that has not been the case for all kids and families. We talked about high-speed internet. I know that a lot of schools have offered ways for children to access high-speed internet through their parking lots. But even to think about having to kind of get out of your house to go and then sit in a parking lot and try to learn and participate in classes or do homework or do other activities in that parking lot, that even in and of itself can be a major stressor. And then another piece from the educational side of things and from the educator side of things is access to appropriate training for educators. And I'm not an educator. I'm definitely not an expert to talk about this, but just seeing just from like a psychiatry standpoint and how mental health had to shift its delivery and its processes in order to be delivered virtually, I can only imagine how much training is needed and how much practice is needed for educators to learn how to adapt to this digital learning time that we've had to face. And then there's a quality issue. There's the quality about remote instruction issue. And when I say quality about remote instruction, I don't necessarily mean the effort that is being put in by the school or the educator, it could be a matter of different subjects are probably better able to be delivered remotely rather than other subjects that might require hands-on experience or might require some practice skills or more one-on-one attention. It might be the quality of the instruction that the child receives is also going to, again, depend on the first two things that we talked about. So access to technology, access to high-speed internet, actually committing to going to the online sessions. So having the appropriate parental support and parental involvement will all play into that. And then, all of these things can actually lead to student burnout and teacher burnout because of the fact that, again, this is a very unknown territory to a lot of us. This is not something that we had the chance to really, truly, I think, prepare for, maybe a little bit more so this academic year, but definitely not much time to prepare during the last academic year. So the other stressor that we talked about is the interruption in terms of the social skill development. So the in-person schooling for kids doesn't just play a major role in terms of education and learning, but that's where kids actually learn to develop their social skills. And that is an equally important component that they need to work on in order to be able to become functional members of society. So what do we have with the pandemic? Well, we have social distancing. So that can be disruptive in terms of social skills building. We have a lack of consistent peer interactions. And this is more so in terms of the concept of going between virtual, hybrid, in-person, and kind of having that cycle happen. So sometimes kids are able to interact with peers. Other times kids are not able to interact with peers, depending on how concerned families are and depending on what regions they live in, what communities they live in. Even during schools being virtual, some kids may have the ability to interact with peers in their neighborhood, but other kids may not have that ability and opportunity. And so there's a lot of inconsistency in terms of how well kids can interact with their peers. And then there's something to be said about the one-on-one teacher-student relationship and how that can be disrupted when everything shifts to virtual. And if you've been able to have that relationship with a child before switching to virtual, maybe things are a little bit easier. But for new teachers and new students to kind of form that relationship solely on a virtual platform, I think takes away from the strength of that relationship and the importance that relationship can have later on in the student's ability to learn and participate in the class. Sedentary lifestyle, I wanted to stick it in here because I think it's partly related to social skills and partly related to the notion of just kind of like having to distance and having a lot of things shut down and how that is negatively impacting our kids, including their learning, just kind of not being able to release that negative energy or that energy in general that kids might have because they're stuck in front of a screen, and then how that might impact them in terms of showing more signs of impulsivity or showing more signs of inattentiveness. And then we touched a little bit about on this already, but just the social isolation that's kind of that's happened with all of this pandemic and how that's affecting social skill development. And then we talked about the cycle, the virtual, hybrid, in-person cycle, and the fact that kids have had to shift. We went to virtual schooling last March. A lot of schools opened in a virtual mode, and then they were able to shift in a hybrid mode. So kids were able to go into in-person for some time. And then a lot of schools had to shift back to a virtual mode again because of either isolated student exposures or exposures within the school. So what this has meant for kids is basically a constant disruption in routines. And the reason why I highlight that is because routines are actually very, very important for kids. Kids learn based on routines. Kids have better emotion regulation based on routines. And so this constant disruption can have a very negative impact on kids and can definitely add to their stress. And then you have the kids who already might have some peer anxiety, some school anxiety, and the fact that there is this constant disruption and this constant going back and forth is actually feeding their anxiety and making it much worse rather than helping it. And they also have had to adjust their learning methods, and teachers have also had to adjust their teaching methods. So, again, talking about the stressors of needing to jump from virtual to in-person and then back. And then I said that, I wanted to focus a little bit more on learning loss. So just a very catching title from the Washington Post that reads, "A Lost Generation, Surge of Research Reveals Students Sliding Backward, Most Vulnerable, Worst Affected." And I wanted to devote a few slides to this because I think that it's a real threat. It caught us off guard in March. It was one thing that we had to close the schools at that point, but I think the fact that this pandemic is continuing, I think that we don't know when the end in sight is. Not to sound pessimistic here, but I know that there's a lot of progress made in terms of vaccines, and there is definitely a lot of hope. But the truth is that we don't know exactly when the end will be, and how much longer kids will have to kind of go back and forth between these virtual and in-person environments. And I think the worst of it all is that, like the title says, those who are worst affected are actually the most vulnerable ones. And what this pandemic has highlighted even further is that there's huge racial and economic disparities in terms of learning, and also in terms of learning loss, unfortunately. So this is some research that was done by a company called McKinsey, and they basically looked at exactly the concept of learning loss. This is a very busy slide, so I apologize, but essentially what I wanted to kind of point with this slide is what their research found. So if you look at the dark line, that represents the growth in terms of a normal academic year. So they went all the way back to September of 2019. And if you see the trajectory is upward from September all the way through approximately June. And then in a normal year, had we not had this disruption in March, there would be a small dip over the summer months. So June, July, August, there would be a small dip in learning and attainment of information. And then that would quickly pick up again starting from August into the 2020-2021 school year. And now the next three lines represent three different scenarios. So the first scenario was a return to class in the fall of 2020. The second scenario was a return to in-person class in January of 2021. And the third scenario, which is the worst scenario, was a return to class in the fall of 2021. And basically what you see with these scenarios is that there's huge drops in terms of academic achievements in kids. And, obviously a lot of this is going to depend again on the quality of instruction, the ability of kids, the kids' abilities to access instruction remotely, parental support. So there's going to be a lot of confounding variables that are going to play into this. But to me, there's a huge drop. I like pictures, and I see this diagram as a picture that has a very strong message, basically indicating that we have to pay attention to this learning loss, because particularly for the most vulnerable ones, they could end by next summer, by summer of 2021, they could basically end at a much lower point than where they were in the summer of 2019. So that to me is huge. And then what they also looked at is learning loss in months, assuming scenario 2. So they made an assumption. This study was done before the fall of 2020. And they made an assumption that scenario 2 was going to be in-person schooling in the fall of 2020. And even with in-person schooling starting in the fall of 2020, you actually still see that there's huge gaps of learning loss. And they were foreseeing that low-income students would actually almost have a year's worth, so 12 months worth of learning loss that would then need to be caught up. So pretty dramatic numbers, particularly when you think about these being the most important years for kids, and these being the years that kids are setting their foundations for later on success in life. And not to keep repeating myself, but again, the worst thing for me is that the most vulnerable children are going to be the ones that are going to be impacted the most out of all of this. So now to switch gears a little bit and kind of talk about more positive things. So, I painted a pretty dire picture, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can actually do. And that doesn't mean that there isn't room for hope that we can actually maybe prevent some of these stressors for kids and really help them succeed and build resilience. So what are some things that educators can do? Well, first and foremost, and we've talked a little bit about this in other flash talks is that they can familiarize themselves with signs of stress and try to recognize signs of stress early in their students and urge them to do something about that. Try to acknowledge anxiety, fear, frustration, and burnout, particularly as this pandemic has kept on going. And as there's this constant change in routines, to really have open discussions with students about them feeling burnt out and what are some things that they can do and what are some things that educators can do to help them stay motivated. Practice active listening, not just with children, but also be able to reach out to families as time permits. Educators can play a very, very important role in terms of highlighting for families that maybe there's things that they too can do as parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, extended guardians, extended families, in terms of supporting these kids through this difficult situation that we're all in. And then at the same time, also kind of assess for maladaptive interactions between parents and children, because as we had talked about in previous flash talks, there has been an increase in intrafamilial violence because of the stressors from the pandemic kind of weighing on the entire family system as a whole. So really kind of having an ear out and listening for kids for their reports about any major stressors or major issues in terms of their communication or in terms of their interactions with the family members, and really trying to get the families, the support for the families. Assess for other stressors that are related to this pandemic, because these are the kinds of stressors that are definitely going to prevent kids from being able to take advantage of virtual learning and being able to actually master skills. So food insecurity, financial stressors, lack of internet, lack of access to internet, lack of access to technology, all of those things are going to be important for teachers and educators and administrators to be on the lookout for. And then we talked about the importance of routines. And so I would urge educators to really try to create, if you have to, new routines, and then maintain them as much as possible. So if you can transfer some of the routines that you used to do in your in-person classes to online, that's great. If you need to create new routines for kids, new structures for kids, that can be very helpful too, as long as you maintain them as much as possible, because it will help kids feel more secure in their environment. And then also know when to refer for help, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we talk about signs of stress. So other things that you might be able to do is to try to see if you can establish one-on-one check-ins with students. Out of all the times, these stressful times are going to be this is going to be very, very impactful, because kids will then be able to, maybe reach out, open up, talk about the things that are troubling them, recognize that they're not alone in feeling this way. And that can always be something very helpful for kids. Focus on social development, particularly during remote learning periods. So knowing that the disruption in in-person schooling has caused a pretty big deficit in terms of social interactions, thinking about ways to engage kids, particularly the shy kids. And so one suggestion that I found online, which I thought was really cool, was setting up something like a turn and talk, but actually using phone calls instead. So creating assignments for kids to like splitting them into groups and creating assignments for kids for them to talk offline about a specific topic and maybe come back and report to the rest of the class, in order to ensure that even the more shy kids will actually have some social interaction. Encourage kids to open up about emotions, linking back to what we said in the previous slide about recognizing anxiety and frustration and burnout. Sometimes kids benefit if you actually give them the words to describe their emotions, and you can even use language as, if I were in your shoes, I might feel X. I might feel sad, I might feel anxious, I might feel upset, to really help them start building that emotion identification process that comes with maturity. Definitely try to be on the lookout for those students who are at risk of being left behind. So the students with the increased social stressors, the students with the poor relationships within their families, the students who maybe have learning needs, special learning needs, students with pre-existing mental health conditions. All of those are students who are at much greater risk of being left behind. So really, really kind of paying closer attention to those students and flagging them for more supports. And then, because even kids who don't necessarily have specific learning disorders or specific mental health issues, they might learn differently through the virtual environment. So really thinking about or preparing oneself for a greater variability in terms of achievement and in terms of progress, and being ready to tackle that, and maybe even consider differential instruction for some of those kids, maybe splitting them into different groups, or thinking about other creative ways to get to those kids as much as the kids who are making progress. So jumping back to the signs of stress and things that educators can be on the lookout for. So the most important thing to remember is that kids are not little adults. And the reason why I say that is because kids are going to be less likely to just walk up to an adult and say, I'm feeling stressed today. Some might, but there are other things that you will be able to kind of pay attention to, which we're going to talk about in a second, that might give you cues that they are indeed experiencing stress. So when we think about signs of stress, I like to break it down to emotional signs of stress and physical signs of stress. So we'll start off with emotional signs of stress. So one of the biggest hallmarks of stress in kids is increased irritability. So all of a sudden, kids seeming like more, having low frustration tolerance, being more irritable, being more cranky, having anger outbursts, temper tantrums, seeming more impulsive, even though they didn't used to be impulsive in the past. Having decreased concentration, not being able to complete tasks, having, some of them might present with more visible low mood, so seeming more isolated, more down, not as willing to joke, not as engaged, possibly having some crying episodes, having repetitive worry thoughts, seeming as if they are stuck on specific concepts and kind of going through them over and over again, not being able to shift their gear to think about other things. And then they might report changes in their sleep pattern, either feeling too tired, needing to sleep too much, or not being able to sleep at all. So these are some, and lack of interest. Sorry, I forgot the last one. And seeming like they're not interested in the same things that they used to be interested before. Now, one of the tricky things is that a lot of these signs might be very, very obvious when you're doing in-person teaching and when you have kids in the classroom, but it might be a lot harder to actually pick out when we're talking about virtual interactions. And for that reason, it might be even more important, again, to kind of set up these one-on-one sessions with kids to maybe be able to pay a little bit closer attention to how they're doing and seeing if any of these symptoms or signs of stress are popping up. So then the other thing that we talked about is the physical signs of stress. So kids might, again, complain about changes in energy levels, so seeming more tired all of a sudden, complaining about fatigue, complaining about headaches, complaining about stomach aches, complaining about GI symptoms, so diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. Our GI tract is very, very much connected to our brain, so a lot of symptoms of stress will manifest with GI symptoms, so it's very important to kind of be on the lookout for those. Kids might complain about feeling like their chest is tight, or their heart is racing, or they're feeling short of breath. And these are just some of the physical signs that they might be better able to actually describe and talk about versus the emotional signs. So if you hear of a child all of a sudden constantly complaining about all of these things, be on the lookout that this kid might be experiencing a lot more stress than maybe you had assumed in the beginning. Other more general signs of stress, hopefully ones that you won't necessarily encounter all that frequently, but still very serious, and ones that we need to be aware of, are an increase in substance abuse, which we talked about before, and which is definitely the case with the COVID-19 pandemic. Self-injury, so kids all of a sudden presenting with new scars, new scratches, or even talking about self-harm thoughts, suicidal ideation, and then aggression. And then when I was thinking about stressors in the classroom, Again, when you have kids in an in-person classroom, it might be a lot easier to see all of these kinds of stressors that we talked about before. But in the virtual classroom, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So the things that I would want to flag for a virtual classroom are definitely paying attention to decreased participation, and particularly if this denotes a change from how the kid used to be before. Lack of engagement, so all of a sudden no longer attending classes, sessions, not doing schoolwork, a drop in grades, just seeming unmotivated, and then definitely if there's dropout talk, because one of the biggest concerns and something that we're starting to see a lot with the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot of kids are dropping out of school because it's been very, very hard for them to either access virtual learning or maintain their engagement in virtual learning. We spent the last 10 or so slides talking about stressors for kids, but I don't want to leave teachers out. So this has been a very, very stressful situation for everybody, and particularly for teachers too, who are expected to, again, maybe all of a sudden teach virtually when they weren't necessarily prepared. They're expected to try to maintain kids' motivations. They may be dealing with their own stressors, their own mental health needs, or their own impact from the pandemic. So really taking the time to think about each other, as teachers, to be reaching out to colleagues, to maybe for schools to consider having support groups for teachers, whether it be support groups that talk about like day-to-day difficulties, like technical difficulties, or how to keep kids motivated, or support groups that might go into a little bit more of the mental health side of things and talk about stressors for educators as well. Because if the educator themselves is feeling a lot of stress, it's going to be much harder for them to be able to identify stressors in kids and become a support for them. So, thinking about stress, all the stress that we're all under, I talked before about knowing when to seek help. And one thing that's going to be really important for all of us to know is that we're not alone in this. There's a lot of resources out there, anywhere from websites to support groups to mental health community clinics and services that are out there for educators, for kids, for families. So really don't feel that you are alone. Think about who you can consult with. And so if you're an educator, you have colleagues. So consulting with your colleagues, consulting with a special education team if it comes to kids that you're worried about, knowing what the local mental health services are in your area. And I put on here the New Directions resource line. It's our main number, and we are absolutely happy to be a resource for educators if they want to bounce ideas or talk to us about concerning situations that they might be dealing with. Even if it's not necessarily to make a referral to New Directions, we might be able to help and get you connected with other types of services that are out in the community. And then also it's going to be important for educators to become a resource for families. So knowing how to guide families if you notice that a family system is under a lot of stress, maybe gently bringing that to the parents' attention, helping the parents navigate the system, making recommendations for parents to reach out to their kids' pediatricians, their family doctors, providing the parents with the local mental health crisis number that they could use. And I have on this slide the Fayette County crisis line through Chestnut Ridge, and also the family support resource line. And then also being able to give them things like the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline in case you're worried about any safety concerns. And to kind of wrap up on a positive note, and I had mentioned that in a previous talk before, and I really truly believe that is that strong supportive relationships with caring adults will have the biggest impact, and are something that we can all kind of invest in to really try to protect these kids from all of the stress. And the next few slides, I can make the slides available. The next few slides just have some helpful links and the Chestnut Ridge Counseling Services phone line. So I will pause here, and I will try to make Kathy the moderator again, which I don't remember how to do.
up to my name under panelist.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
That's okay. There you go. Amazing information, Dr. Maneta. Oh, the statistics that you were giving in some of those slides. Wow. Do we have any questions for Dr. Maneta? Now's the time to ask. I'm blown away by everything that you just talked about. It was fantastic. Beth Hudson says, thank you. I will have you send me your slide deck. I did get a request for that. And also, we will be posting this on the Fayette Business Education Partnership website under our teacher resource page, which we will be getting updated. And all that information will be sent out to everyone. I'm blending into the beach behind me. Any questions? Any questions going once? Oh, yay. Is there a way to get to you if they have additional questions?
Yes, what I can do is I can add my email address on the slide deck. So if folks want to email me with questions, I'm happy to answer it that way.
Great. Those resources that you gave at the end are very, very extremely helpful. I can't say enough about those for the teachers, especially to open your door like that, to be able to answer any questions that they may have through New Directions. Not necessarily a referral, like you said, but to even just bounce ideas off of. Great resource.
Yes, and you know, we just recognize how stressful this whole situation is, and obviously I am primarily associated with New Directions, but I've gotten to know a lot of the other resources in the area. So our family-based team we work very closely with, our school-based team we work very closely with. So you know, I can definitely, you know, and all of us at New Directions, actually, not just me, we can definitely point people in the right direction.
Great. Last call for questions, and then we're going to let her go. And just want to remind everybody that we will be finishing our last session next Wednesday at 1 o'clock with our next steps of teacher in the workplace and what we have ideas on going forward. We're going to need some of your help and giving us ideas. I'll be sending the link out. I'll wait until I get your slide deck, and then I'll send that with the link to the next meeting. Mike Quinn says, just an FYI, they are working on a teacher support group with one of the districts and having a special mental health section on at least 2 websites in districts. So Mike, if you want to get me that information, that we can put that link on our teacher resource page as well. So that way, you know, cross market the information. So anything else before we let go of everyone? Thank you, Dr. Maneta. Again, it was great to see you. I'm sure we'll have more talks about this in the months to come, because like you said in your presentation, we just don't know when it's going to end. And I feel like we all may need a mental stress break and to listen to you tell us how to do that. So
Anytime.
All right, great.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.